People often mistake the counseling office for a place where tears are dried. That is a misconception. This room is a forensic lab. For 15 years, I have not just listened to what students say, I have read what they do not write. I keep a private list in my bottom drawer. It does not contain the names of the troublemakers or the loud kids. It contains 3 specific files that hold identical silences. I had found a pattern of SOS I had never seen before, and I had exactly 14 days before graduation to decode it, before those 3 students walked out the gates and went silent forever. The late afternoon sun sliced through the blinds, cutting the linoleum floor into strips of dust and shadow. My desk was a fortress built of paper. It was scholarship season. In a public high school like ours, this process was not about prestige. It was about survival. For some of these kids, the difference between a state university and a minimum wage shift at the local logistics warehouse was a single 500-word essay titled "The Obstacle I Overcame." I rubbed my eyes. The smell of laser printer ink and cheap recycled paper hung in the air, dry and acrid. I had read 40 essays since lunch. I knew the rhythm of teenage ambition too well. I knew the formula. First came the heroes, captains, and presidents shouting about resilience. Then came the tragedies, sick puppies and divorces wrapped in a neat bow. I reached for the next file. Jonathan. Top 10%. His transcript was a grid of perfect as. I started to read. The prose was clean, almost clinical. Then, the rhythm broke. It wasn't the anger that scared me, he wrote. It was the sound of the porcelain. When the plate hit the wall, it didn't shatter immediately. It made a sharp, high-pitched ringing sound. Then came the pieces. I learned to look at the floor, to count the shards. Because if I looked up, I would have to see the face that threw it. I stopped. My finger hovered over the paper. The ringing sound. It was specific. I set his file aside and picked up the next one. Sarah. She worked 20 hours a week. Her essay was about balancing the register. Until the end, it feels like a bell ringing, sharp and high, signaling that the round is over. I look at my shoes. I count the scuff marks. If I look up, I become part of the fight. The air in my office seemed to thin, signaling the end of a round. Look at the floor. Count. The phrasing was not identical, but the architecture of the fear was. It was the same specific, quiet observation. I stood up and walked to the filing cabinet. My knees popped. I needed to find the third one. I flipped through the maybe pile until I found Michael, the transfer student, the ghost in the library. I found the paragraph, "The lock on my door is broken." I use a chair to wedge it shut. When the shouting starts, I wait for the crash. It usually sounds like glass or china hitting the wall. A ringing sound. That's my signal. I sit on the floor and count the threads in the carpet. 1, 2, 3. I never look up. I sat back down, the chair groaning under my weight. 3 different students. The athlete, the worker, the ghost. They had nothing in common except this single, terrifying sequence of sensory details. This was not plagiarism. Kids copied homework. They did not copy trauma. This felt designed. It felt like a code. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside, buried under old training manuals, was a yellow legal pad. This was not an official document. If the district ever audited my files, this pad would not be subject to a legal hold or a subpoena. It was just my memory, externalized. I uncapped my pen. My hand felt heavy. I wrote the names. Jonathan. Sarah. Michael. 15 years ago, I had ignored a similar silence. I had called it resilience due to my professional distance. A girl had disappeared into the cracks. Not this time. I glanced at the wall calendar. The graduation date was circled in red marker. 14 days. 14 days until the district washed its hands of these files. The scholarship committee would see, grit, I saw a fuse. The bell rang, sharp and loud in the hallway, signaling the end of the school day. It made me jump. I closed the yellow pad and shoved it back into the drawer. I locked it. The sound of the key turning in the metal lock echoed in the empty room, loud as a gunshot. The red circle on the wall calendar looked less like a date and more like a target. May 25th. Graduation. In any other profession, a deadline is a fluid concept, something that can be pushed back with a strategic delay. In a public high school, it is a cliff edge. The date is set in stone, printed on thousands of invitations. Once those kids walk across the stage in their polyester gowns, shaking the principal's hand, they are gone. Their files are boxed up. Their school email accounts are deactivated within 48 hours. They vanish into the adult world where there are no guidance counselors, only shift supervisors. I stared at the number 25. I had exactly 14 days. In this town, a college scholarship isn't a bonus. It isn't extra pocket money for textbooks. It is a life raft. The local economy is a flat line of retail chains. You either get escape velocity at 18, or you stay forever. The obstacle I overcame essay is the engine of that raft. My job, officially, is to polish their grammar. But unofficially, I hold the power to puncture the raft. If I flag an essay as problematic, if I suggest a student is living in an abusive environment, I trigger a protocol. Parents are called. Child Protective Services is notified. The police might get involved. The admissions officers at state universities, who want clean, uncomplicated candidates, get wind of the drama. They pull the offers. The student stays home to deal with the fallout. I save their physical safety, perhaps, but I kill their future. But if I'm right about the code in these essays, and I do nothing, I opened the bottom drawer again, bypassing the fresh yellow legal pad. My hand drifted to the back, to the dusty space where I kept the things I should have shredded years ago. There was a single manila folder there. No name on the tab. Just a year, written in my own hand, 2014. I pulled it out. The paper felt heavy, damp with the humidity of a decade. Her name was Elena. She had been quiet, sharp. 10 years ago, she sat across from me. She had written an essay about gravity. I live in a house where gravity is heavier than it is outside. Things fall constantly. Cups. Plates. Me. The gravity pulls us down and keeps us there. I remembered the moment perfectly. I remembered the smell of her vanilla perfume, trying to mask the scent of stale cigarette smoke. I was young then. I was new. I was so eager to find student voice, I had circled that paragraph in red pen. In the margin, I had written, "Excellent use of metaphor." I thought I was being a good teacher. I didn't hear the silence behind the metaphor. I treated her trauma as an aesthetic choice. She got the scholarship. 2 weeks after graduation, the police found her. The gravity was her stepfather. By the time the ambulance came, the damage was permanent. She never went to college. She disappeared into the cracks of the system. The guilt of that red margin note has sat in my throat for 10 years. It is a stone that never dissolves. I looked back at the current files. The ringing sound. This wasn't poetry. It was the same mechanism as the gravity. A way to speak the truth without breaking the rule of silence. If I intervened now, I risked blowing up their escape routes, just like I risked with Elena. But if I stayed silent, I was sending them back into the house with the ringing sound. The clock on the wall ticked. It was an old analog clock, the kind that hums before it clicks. Hum-click. 14 days. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper. I needed to map this out. I couldn't just accuse parents based on a literary motif. I needed proof. I needed to know if this code had a history. I wrote down the timeline. May 11th. Essays flagged. May 25th. The cliff edge. I had to move fast. But I had to move quietly. Quiet. Forensic confessional. That's what I called this mode. No sirens. Just the cold, hard work of reading between the lines. I picked up the phone. I didn't dial the parents. I dialed the extension for the English department. Mrs. Gable. She had taught Elena 10 years ago. She was teaching Jonathan now. If there was a pattern, maybe it wasn't just in the essays, Helen, I said when she answered. My voice sounded steady. A practiced lie. I have a question about the prose style in a few of the senior essays. Do you have a minute? I wasn't just a counselor anymore. I was an archivist of ghosts. And I wasn't going to let 3 more names end up in the unmarked folder at the back of my drawer. The walk from the counselling suite to the English department was a journey between 2 different atmospheres. My office was a vacuum of silence and tissues, a place designed to absorb sound. The English wing was loud. It smelled of dry erase markers, stale coffee, and the specific, dusty anxiety of impending deadlines. I held my notebook against my chest like a shield. I wasn't just walking down a hallway. I was crossing a border. In the ecosystem of a high school, counselors and teachers often view the same student as 2 completely different species. To me, a student is a collection of stressors. To a teacher, they are a grade, a seat number, and a potential plagiarism risk. I found Helen Gable in the staff workroom. She was buried behind a stack of papers that looked unstable enough to collapse and crush her. Helen had been teaching AP literature for 20 years. She was the gatekeeper of the senior essay. Do you have a minute? I asked. Helen didn't look up immediately. Her red pen hovered over a paragraph like a scalpel. She finally sighed, dropping the pen. For you? Maybe. For a student asking for an extension. Absolutely not. I have 3 students, I said, choosing my words with the precision of a bomb disposal technician. Different social circles, different academic levels. But their personal essays, they have a section that is nearly identical. Not word-for-word plagiarism, Helen, but the imagery, the structure. It's the same. Helen waved a hand dismissively. She reached for her coffee mug. It's the internet, she said. They all do it. They go on Reddit or TikTok. They search for essays that got into Harvard. They find a formula that works, usually something tragic but overcoming, and they mimic it. It's not a conspiracy. It's just laziness. It's specific, I countered. It's about the sound of breaking porcelain. About counting things on the floor to avoid looking up. It feels lived in. Helen sighed again. She spun her laptop around. Look, she said. She clicked open a folder on the school's shared drive labeled Essay Resources. I give them sample essays. Previous winners. They absorb the tone. Sometimes they absorb a little too much. She clicked on a file. They mimic each other. 2. They share Google Docs. They peer edit. If one kid writes a powerful sentence about a broken plate, 3 other kids will see it and think, oh, that sounds literary, and they'll riff on it. It's an echo chamber. You're looking for a psychological breakthrough. But what you're seeing is just bad creative writing. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was logical. It was safe. It turned a scream for help into a copyright issue. It transformed a potential crisis into a grading rubric. The system loved explanations like this. They required no paperwork. They required no uncomfortable phone calls to parents. If it was just plagiarism, the solution was a 0 on the assignment, not an intervention. But I looked at the screen. I saw the timestamps on the files. Some of them dated back years. The ecosystem of these essays was older than the current senior class. I looked at Helen. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't trying to bury the truth. She was just tired. She had 60 essays to grade, and she needed the world to be simple so she could go home at 5 o'clock. To her, a repeated phrase was an annoyance. To me, it was a signal flare. Her explanation was convenient. It was a sedative. "Can I get access?" I asked, to the archive folder. "I just want to cross-reference the dates." Helen shrugged and scribbled the file path on a sticky note. "Knock yourself out." I took the note. It felt heavier than it should have. Helen saw a repository of homework. I saw a timeline of silence. I stood up. The bell rang for the passing period. A jarring, electric shriek. I wasn't going back to the likely pile. I was going to find the ghost in the machine. The school archive room was tucked away in the basement, next to the boiler room. It was a space that the architects had forgotten to label. A windowless concrete box that smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the dry, sweet scent of decaying paper. Most of the student records had been digitized 5 years ago, but the physical artifacts, the yearbooks, the literary magazines, the award plaques, still lived here in metal cabinets that groaned when you touched them. I didn't turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. The hum was too loud, too aggressive for what I was about to do. Instead, I relied on the glow of the single computer terminal in the corner, a dusty machine that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit about the early internet. Helen's sticky note with the file path was stuck to the bezel of the monitor. It felt heavy in the dim light. I wasn't just logging into a shared drive. I was opening a tomb. Upstairs, the school was alive, with the chaotic energy of 2,000 teenagers rushing toward the final bell. Down here, the silence was absolute. It pressed against my eardrums. I typed in my credentials. The fan inside the computer whirred to life, a mechanical wheeze that sounded like a cough. I navigated through the folders. Administration. Curriculum. English department. Archived student work. I paused. My finger hovered over the mouse. Once I opened this door, I couldn't close it. I couldn't unknow what was inside. I started with the class of 2021. It was a random choice, a test cast into the dark water of the past. I opened a folder of distinguished essays. I scanned the PDFs, looking for the signal. Resilience. Grit. Overcoming obstacles. The usual narratives washed over me, a sea of well-intentioned clichés. Then, in a file belonging to a girl named Chloe, I found it. It wasn't the ringing sound this time. It was the vibration. I lay on the floor and pressed my ear to the carpet. Chloe had written, I could feel the footsteps downstairs. Heavy. Stumbling. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. If they stopped at the bottom of the stairs, I was safe. If they started to climb, I had to become invisible. My breath hitched. It wasn't a match for the ringing porcelain, but the architecture was identical. The counting. The hyper-awareness of sensory details. The strategy of becoming small. I went back further. 2019. A boy named David. His essay was about playing the cello, but in the middle, there was a jagged interruption. The music is the only thing that drowns out the breaking glass. I play louder. I play until my fingers bleed. I count the measures, because if I stop counting, I have to listen to what is happening in the kitchen. It was sporadic. It wasn't every year. It wasn't a flood. It was a slow, steady drip of poison that had been leaking into the school's water supply for years, unnoticed by anyone who was just checking for grammar. I worked backward through the timeline, my eyes burning from the blue light of the screen. 2017. 2016. The files took longer to load the further back I went, as if the machine itself was reluctant to remember. By the time I reached 2015, I had stopped reading the hero essays entirely. I was hunting for the ghosts. I pulled the yellow legal pad from my bag. I couldn't keep this in my head anymore. I needed to see it. I drew a grid on the paper. Year. Name. Keyword. 2024. Jonathan. Sarah. Michael. Ringing. / vibration. 2021. Chloe. Footsteps. / carpet. 2019. David. Cello. / glass. 2016. Sam. Door slamming. / counting breaths. The ink bled slightly into the cheap paper. When I looked at the list, it wasn't just data. It was a lineage. This wasn't a coincidence. And it wasn't a viral TikTok trend. TikTok didn't exist in 2016. This was something else. This was a legacy. Someone had planted a seed in this school a decade ago, a template for how to speak about the unspeakable, and it had been passed down, whispered from class to class. A survival guide disguised as homework. I stared at the table I had created. It was the most terrifying document I had ever produced. It was proof that while the administration worried about test scores and football stats, a shadow curriculum had been running parallel to the official one. We had been grading their grammar while they were trying to tell us they were drowning. I sat back in the creaky chair, the yellow pad heavy on my lap. The basement air felt colder now. I had come down here looking for a simple answer. A patient 0 to explain the current anomaly. Instead, I had found a graveyard. This wasn't just about Jonathan, Sarah, and Michael anymore. It was about Chloe, David, Sam, and who knew how many others I had missed in the years I hadn't checked. How many of them had I waved at in the hallway? How many of them had I congratulated on their resilience before sending them off to college with a smile and a wave? I had been a counselor for most of this timeline. I was the one who was supposed to hear them, but I had been listening for shouts, and they had been writing in whispers. The computer screen flickered, the screensaver threatening to engage. I jiggled the mouse. I wasn't done. I needed to find the source. The pattern faded out around 2014. That was the horizon. Somewhere in that year lay the origin. The first student who had figured out how to turn their fear into a scholarship essay. A bell rang in the distance, muffled by the concrete ceiling. School was out. The noise upstairs would be deafening, lockers slamming, shouts of freedom. But down here, the silence was heavy, weighted with 10 years of unheard confessions. I looked at the red circle on my mental calendar. 14 days. It felt laughable now. I wasn't just fighting a 2-week deadline. I was fighting a decade of inertia. I closed the legal pad, tucking the list of ghosts into my bag. I had the what and the when. Now I had to face the who. My office is professionally designed to be a sanctuary. The beige walls, the soft lighting, the bowl of mints that gathers dust. It is all engineered to lower the heart rate. But today, as I waited for the first appointment, the room felt less like a safe haven and more like an interrogation room where the mirrors were facing inward. I had scheduled appointments with all 3 students under the administrative guise of scholarship application finalization. I wasn't lying. Technically, their applications were final, but the truth inside them was still fluid. First was Jonathan. He sat on the very edge of the guest chair, his posture rigid enough to snap under a strong breeze. He looked less like a high school senior and more like a young senator preparing for a hostile press conference. He wore a button-down shirt that was pressed with military precision. When I gently pushed his essay across the desk and pointed to the paragraph about the porcelain shattering against the wall, he didn't flinch. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at me, his eyes practiced and cool. "It's a metaphor. Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth, rolling over the words like a stone in a river. "It represents the crushing pressure of academic expectations. The shards are my fragmented time. The ringing is the anxiety of deadlines." He was lying. I knew it. And deep down, he knew I knew it. But his lie was structural. It was a load-bearing wall designed to keep his house and his acceptance to Stanford from collapsing. He had intellectualized his terror. He had turned the sound of a plate hitting a wall into a literary device because that was the only currency the system accepted from a boy with a 4.0 GPA. To admit the violence would be to admit imperfection in his household, and imperfection was not allowed on his transcript. I watched him leave, his spine straight. A perfect soldier in a war he wasn't allowed to name. Next was Sarah. She came in wearing her grocery store vest over her hoodie, smelling of industrial sanitizer and damp cardboard. She slumped into the chair, the exhaustion radiating off her in visible waves. When I asked about the vibrating floorboards and the need to count scuff marks on her shoes, she didn't talk about metaphors. She talked about economics. "The apartment walls are thin," she said, picking nervously at a loose thread on her sleeve. "The neighbors fight." "It's loud." I put on headphones so I can focus on my calculus. I count the marks to keep my focus. She was rewriting the narrative from abuse to poverty in her mind. The violence wasn't a crime. It was a side effect of cheap rent. To acknowledge the abuser, her father, would mean acknowledging that they needed to move. And she knew better than anyone that they couldn't afford first and last month's rent anywhere else. Her denial was a financial necessity. She looked at me with eyes that were old for her face. Eyes that begged me not to make her life harder than it already was. "I just need the scholarship," she whispered. "My brother needs me to get it." Then there was Michael, the ghost. He didn't sit. He hovered near the door, as if measuring the distance to the exit. He kept his hood up, casting a shadow over his eyes. When I read his sentence aloud, I use a chair to wedge it shut. He physically recoiled, shrinking into the fabric of his sweatshirt as if I had struck him. He didn't offer a metaphor like Jonathan or an excuse like Sarah. He offered silence. "Is that real?" "Michael?" I asked softly. He looked at the floor. He was counting. I could see his lips moving slightly, ticking off the threads in the carpet, just like he described in the essay. "It's just a story," he finally said, his voice cracking. "You said we needed a story about overcoming obstacles. I gave you one." He wasn't denying the event. He was denying the reality of it. To him, the essay was a fiction he had stepped into to survive, a dissociate state put on paper. They were all telling me the truth about the feeling, but they were all lying about the fact. They had taken the same code and tailored it to fit the masks they wore to survive high school. The pattern I had found in the archive wasn't just a template for writing, it was a template for hiding. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a quiet essay. I was fighting the terrifying adaptability of trauma. They had learned to make their pain palatable for a scholarship committee, and in doing so, they had sealed themselves inside it. The phone call didn't come to my personal cell. It came through the main office line, routed with a digital beep that sounded like a warning shot. It was Jonathan's father. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. His voice was calm, authoritative, the baritone of a man who plays golf with members of the school board and knows exactly where the bodies are buried. "Jonathan tells me you're concerned about his creative writing," he said. The phrase creative writing was weaponized, dripping with condescension. "We appreciate your interest, Ms. Vance, but we are very focused on his Stanford application right now. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings to complicate his file. Domestic privacy is a right, isn't it?" It was a masterclass in soft intimidation. He wasn't threatening my physical safety. He was threatening my professional existence. He was reminding me of the hierarchy. He was drawing a line in the sand with a diamond-tipped cane. He knew exactly what a formal inquiry would do to a transcript. It would freeze it. He was banking on my fear of ruining his son's future to keep me quiet. An hour later, the principal stood in my doorway. He didn't come in. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, radiating a tired sort of tension that I knew well. "I had a call," he said. He didn't need to say from whom. "Look, we all want these kids to be safe. But we are counselors, not detectives. We are educators, not social workers. Unless you have a bruise, a direct disclosure, or a police report, you are walking on a razor wire." He tapped the doorframe with his knuckles. A sharp, hollow sound. If we flag these kids based on a literary motif, and we're wrong, or even if we're right but can't prove it, we lose the trust of the community. We lose the scholarships. They lose their way out. "Do not cross the line unless you are ready to be the one who cuts the rope." He left me there, the boundary drawn clearly in the air between us. Protocol was the shield he used to sleep at night, and he was handing it to me, expecting me to hide behind it too. I sat alone in the dimming light of the late afternoon. The silence of the office pressed against my ears, heavier than the noise of the school day. I closed my eyes, and I was back in 2014. I saw Elena's face. I saw the red ink on her essay where I had written excellent metaphor. I remembered the moment I had hesitated. I had stood at this exact line 10 years ago. I had held a phone just like this one. I had chosen to respect the privacy. I had chosen the safety of the protocol over the intuition of my gut. And because I stayed behind the line, Elena had been pushed down a flight of stairs. The protocol had protected my job, but it hadn't protected her skull. The memory wasn't visual. It was somatic. A cold weight in my chest. A phantom ringing in my ears. I felt the physical nausea of past cowardice rising up to meet the present fear. The ghost of my own negligence was standing in the room with me, demanding an answer. I opened my eyes. The calendar on the wall hadn't moved. 14 days. I was standing on the exact same coordinate of moral geography as I was a decade ago. The system hadn't changed. The threats were identical. The parents were still powerful, and the administration was still risk-averse. The only variable that could change was me. I looked at the yellow legal pad in my drawer, hidden under the manuals. If I crossed the line, I risked blowing up their lives. If I stayed back, I risked letting them die. It was a double bind, a trap designed by a system that valued order over truth. But this time, I knew what lay at the bottom of the stairs. I picked up my pen. I wasn't going to erase the line. I was going to step over it. and I was going to drag the truth with me. The digital breadcrumb trail Helen had reluctantly provided was a labyrinth of subfolders nested inside subfolders, a bureaucratic Russian doll designed to obscure data rather than archive it. I sat in the blue glow of my monitor, the office lights extinguished, navigating through district resources. English depth. Archived samples. 2010 to 2015. The cooling fan of my laptop whirred, struggling against the weight of the massive directory. I wasn't looking for a key word anymore. The ringing and the floorboards were just symptoms. I was looking for a timestamp. The pattern I had mapped on my yellow legal pad suggested the infection started exactly a decade ago. I sorted the files by date created, oldest first. Hundreds of files reshuffled on the screen in a dizzying cascade. Most were generic placeholders. Sample_intro.doc.x. Transition _words.pdf. MLA_citation_guide.ppt. But near the bottom of the list, buried between a grammar guide and a poetic license waiver, was a file simply labeled E_college_essay_final.doc. The timestamp was October 14th, 2014. The name hit me with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. Elena. The girl from the Manila folder in my bottom drawer. The girl I had failed. I double-clicked the file. It opened in an older version of Word, the formatting slightly broken, the margins misaligned by time. I didn't need to read the whole thing. I scrolled past the introduction about overcoming academic struggles to the third paragraph. There it was. The raw material. The source code. It's not the shouting. It's the physics. When the plate hits the wall, it rings like a bell, signaling the end of a round. I look at the floor. I count the shards. 1, 2, 3. If I look up, I have to see the face. And then I become the target. It wasn't exactly the same as Jonathan's polished prose or Sarah's economic rationalization. It was rougher, less refined. It didn't have the sheen of a literary device yet. It was bleeding on the page. Seeing it here, preserved in the digital amber of the school's server, changed the entire nature of the investigation. This wasn't a case of lazy students copying a viral internet post to save time. This was a legacy. Elena hadn't just written an essay. She had built a life raft out of her own wreckage. And somehow, that raft had been preserved in the school's own system, passed down from teacher to student as a good example, stripped of its context until it became just a template for extracting scholarship money. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence. I count the shards. I closed my eyes, and the memory I had been suppressing since Scene 2 finally locked into place with terrifying clarity. I hadn't just read this in 2014. I had edited it. I clicked on the review tab in the document. The comments were still there. Ghost notes from a younger, more naive version of myself. Highlighted in blue. Great imagery here. Elena. Maybe change physics to mechanics. It sounds more academic. Highlighted in yellow. This shows great resilience. I stared at my own words. I was the one who had validated this code. I had taught her that if she packaged her trauma correctly, the system would reward her with funding. And because I had focused on the syntax instead of the safety, I had inadvertently created the mold that Jonathan and Michael were now pouring their own fear into. I wasn't an observer of this pattern. I was its architect. The realization turned my stomach. I had treated a scream for help as a stylistic choice, and in doing so, I had taught a generation of kids that the only way to be heard was to turn their pain into acceptable art. I printed the document, The printer churned in the silence, spitting out the warm proof of my failure. I held the paper in my hands, the ink still smelling sharp. This was the turning point. The moment where the story stopped being about detecting plagiarism and started being about atoning for negligence. The students weren't cheating. They were using the only tool that had ever worked in this building. Elena had left a map behind, a way to navigate the minefield of a violent home and a blind school system. I looked at the clock. The graduation countdown was still ticking, 13 days left, but the stakes had shifted tectonically. I couldn't just flag these essays. I had to find the person who wrote the original code. I needed to know if the life raft had actually saved her, or if I was looking at the debris of a shipwreck. I grabbed my keys. I was done reading. I needed to find the ghost. Finding Elena wasn't difficult. The digital footprint of a survivor is often carefully curated, but professional networks are harder to hide. LinkedIn showed me a profile, Elena Martinez, logistics coordinator. She was still in town, working at the massive distribution center off the highway, a place of concrete and trucks that operated 24 hours a day. I sent a message, carefully worded, invoking the alumni network and career follow-up, avoiding the word trauma. She agreed to meet at a diner halfway between the school and the warehouses, a neutral ground that smelled of grease and old coffee. She was older, obviously, but the wariness in her eyes hadn't aged a day. She sat with her back to the wall, scanning the room as I entered. She wore a high-vis vest over a flannel shirt, her hands rougher than I remembered. When I sat down and slid the printed copy of her 2014 essay across the table, she didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. "I wondered if anyone would ever bring this up again," she said. Her voice was flat, lacking the poetic cadence she used in writing. She touched the paper like it was a loaded weapon. "Is this about copyright? Or are you finally asking if it was true it's about the kids writing it now?" I said. I told her about Jonathan, Sarah, and Michael. I told her about the ringing porcelain and the counting of the threads. I told her how the paragraph had mutated but survived. I watched her face as I spoke. There was no pride there, only a deep, weary sadness. "We didn't have a name for it," she told me, tracing the coffee stain on the Formica table. "We didn't have trauma-informed care or mandatory reporting that actually worked. We just had the essay prompt. The obstacle you overcame. It was the only door that was open." She explained how the draft had been shared. It wasn't a formal distribution. It was whispered in the library, passed on flash drives. "Use this structure. It works." The counselors like the metaphor. It scares them just enough to give you the money, but not enough to call the police. It was a survival algorithm. Elena hadn't just written an essay. She had engineered a social hack. She had found the exact frequency that triggered the scholarship committee's pity without triggering the liability protocols. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt inadequate. Small stones thrown into a canyon. I read this 10 years ago. I graded it. "And I let you go back to that house." Elena looked at me, and her gaze was absolute. It stripped away my professional title. "Don't apologize," she said. "Apologies are for you, to make you feel better." I survived. I got out. But if you're sitting here telling me that 10 years later, kids are still using my old map because it's the only safe passage they have, then you haven't fixed the system. You've just let the road degrade. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the diner's noise. "You want to help them?" "Don't save them from the essay. Save them from the need to write it. Stop grading their pain and start reading the code. You are the only one who knows the cipher." I watched her walk away, merging into the grey afternoon light of the parking lot. She wasn't a ghost. She was the most real thing I had encountered in this entire investigation. She had given me a mandate. I couldn't just tear up the current essays or force the students to rewrite them. That would be taking away their shield. I sat in the booth, the check sitting unpaid on the table, the timeline in my head recalibrated. I didn't just need to stop a few essays from being flagged as plagiarism. I needed to force the school to recognize the code as a valid language. I needed to legitimize the signal so that the next time a kid wrote about counting shards, the response wasn't, "Excellent metaphor, but how can we help?" I pulled out my phone and opened the draft of the proposal I had been toying with. It was time to stop editing and start publishing. The silence ended today. Returning to the school from the diner felt like re-entering a pressurized cabin. The silence of the hallways was deceptive. I knew the noise that was building behind the closed doors of the administration wing. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor, the only light in the room. I wasn't writing a manifesto. Manifestos get thrown in the trash. I was writing a procedural update. I titled the document, Proposal for Enhanced Screening of Scholarship Application Materials. It was boring. It was bureaucratic. It was designed to look harmless to a budget committee while acting as a tripwire for the truth. I didn't ask for a new department. I didn't ask for the police. I asked for a tick box. A single, digital checkbox on the internal review software labeled Counselor Review Recommended, Content Flag. If I could institutionalize the intuition, if I could make it mandatory for a human being to pause and look closer when a student wrote about ringing sounds or broken locks, then the system couldn't plead ignorance anymore. I drafted the language carefully, stripping away the emotion. I replaced trauma with at-risk indicators. I replaced abuse with home environment stability factors. I was translating Elena's pain into the only language the school board understood: liability mitigation. If we know, and we do nothing, we are liable. I was banking on their fear of a lawsuit being stronger than their fear of a scandal. I printed the draft. It was 3 pages long. It felt lighter than the yellow legal pad, but it carried the same weight. I needed a stress test before I took this to the principal. I walked down the hall to the nurse's office. Mary had been at the school longer than I had. She had dispensed ice packs and ibuprofen to 2 generations of students. She knew which kids came in with headaches just to sleep for an hour away from their homes. I handed her the proposal without a word. She read it. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, the hum of the mini fridge filling the silence. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me. "You know what they'll say," she said softly. "They'll say, we don't have the staff. If you flag them, someone has to interview them. Someone has to file the CPS reports. Someone has to deal with the parents screaming in the lobby. "I know," I said, "I'll do it." "I'll take the lead." Mary shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "It's not just the work, Jean. It's the looking. Once you turn on the light, you can't turn it off. You're asking the school to admit that for 50 years. We've been grading cries for help. People don't like to admit they've been blind." She handed the paper back. "But you're right. It's time. Just don't expect them to thank you." I walked back to my office. The calendar on the wall seemed to be vibrating. May 20th. 5 days before graduation. The timeline had compressed into a singularity. If I waited until next year, Jonathan, Sarah, and Michael would be gone. They would be statistics. I couldn't let them leave with the secret intact. I needed to force the school to see them now, while they were still under our roof. I sat at my computer and opened the email client. I attached the proposal. I added the spreadsheet from the archive, the 10-year timeline of the ringing pattern. I added the names of the current students. Redacted but identifiable to anyone with access to the database. My cursor hovered over the Send button. This was the second door of no return. The first was opening the archive. This one was weaponizing it. Sending this email meant I was no longer a confused counselor asking for advice. I was a whistleblower operating from inside the building. I was declaring war on the status quo. I thought of Elena in the diner, touching the paper like a loaded weapon. "Don't save them from the essay," she had said. "Save them from the need to write it." I clicked send. The swoosh sound of the email departing was comically cheerful, a bright little chirp that signaled the end of my career as a safe employee. I packed my bag. I didn't lock the drawer with the yellow pad today. It didn't matter anymore. The secret was out of the drawer and on the server. I walked out to the parking lot, the late spring sun blindingly bright. The school looked peaceful from the outside, a brick fortress of education. But I knew better. I knew the fault lines running through the foundation. I had just detonated a charge deep in the basement, and now I just had to wait for the shockwave to hit the penthouse. The conference room was air-conditioned to the point of discomfort. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, the olfactory signature of administrative dread. The long mahogany table was occupied by the stakeholders of the school's moral economy. The principal at the head, looking tired, the vice principal, tapping a pen, Helen from English, looking anxious, and two representatives from the Parent-Teacher Association. One of them was Jonathan's father. He wore a suit that cost more than my car, and he sat with the relaxed confidence of a man who knows the meeting doesn't start until he speaks. I sat at the far end, my laptop connected to the projector. The hum of the cooling fan was the only sound in the room. I had requested this time on the agenda under Scholarship Review, a vague enough title to ensure attendance. But when I clicked the remote, the screen didn't show GPA averages or college acceptance rates. It showed a timeline, a black line stretching back 10 years, punctuated by red dots. "This is not a graph of academic performance," I said, my voice steady, despite the tremors in my hands. "This is a graph of a single paragraph. A paragraph about breaking porcelain and counting threads on the floor. I walked them through the data. I didn't use the word abuse. I used the word pattern. I showed them the snippets from 2014, 2016, 2019, and 2024. I overlaid them on the screen, highlighting the identical phrases in yellow. The visual was undeniable. It wasn't just similar. It was genealogical. "This is a code," I told them. "It is a language developed by our students to bypass our filters. They are telling us they are unsafe, and they are doing it in the only venue where we listen to them." The scholarship essay. The room was silent. Helen was staring at the screen, her hand covering her mouth. The principal was rubbing his temples. But Jonathan's father didn't look at the screen. He looked at me. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice dropping an octave. A rumble of thunder. "This is a fascinating literary analysis. But are you suggesting that because my son used a metaphor about a plate, the school has the right to investigate my home? This sounds like a gross overreach of your mandate. It sounds like defamation." The air in the room froze. This was the threat. The lawsuit. The scandal. The principal shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to the door. "We have to be careful with accusations. Jean," he murmured, "we can't act on metaphors. It's not a metaphor to them," I said, standing up, "and I'm not accusing you, sir. I'm accusing us." I clicked the slide to the final image. It was the 2014 essay. Elena's essay, and next to it, blown up in grainy resolution, were my own handwritten notes in the margin. Excellent use of metaphor. "I didn't find this pattern because I'm a detective," I said. looking directly at the principal, then at Helen, then at Jonathan's father. I found it because I am part of it. 10 years ago, I read this. I praised it. I gave this student a scholarship, and 2 weeks later, the metaphor pushed her down a flight of stairs and put her in the ICU. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It wasn't the silence of boredom anymore. It was the silence of shame. I had taken the weapon out of Jonathan's father's hand. I hadn't claimed moral superiority. I had claimed negligence. I had admitted that the system, that I had failed. We taught them this, I said, my voice breaking for the first time. We taught them that we only reward their pain if it's pretty, if it's polite. We created this code, and now we have a choice. We can recognize it, or we can wait for the next ambulance. I sat down. The projector hummed. Jonathan's father opened his mouth to speak, but closed it. He looked at the screen, at the red ink of my past failure. He couldn't attack me without attacking the evidence of the harm. The principal looked at the timeline. He looked at me. He looked at the proposal I had placed in front of him, the simple request for a tick box. The calculus in his eyes was shifting. The cost of action was high, yes, but I had just laid out the cost of inaction, and it was measured in blood. The proposal, the principal said, his voice rough. Walk us through the implementation. It wasn't a victory parade. It was a grim acceptance of a burden. But the conversation had shifted. We weren't talking about literary devices anymore. We were talking about safety. The room felt smaller, heavier, but for the first time in 10 years, it felt honest. The adrenaline of the conference room dissipated the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the last parent. What remained in the principal's office was the stale, recycled air of bureaucracy and the sharp scent of ozone from the photocopier in the outer rim. The principal sat behind his desk, not as an adversary, but as a man calculating the structural integrity of a building after an earthquake. The vice principal and Helen from English were there, too. We weren't a tribunal anymore. We were a damage control unit. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of the principal's pen against a leather-bound notebook. He didn't look angry. Anger implies passion. He looked exhausted. The look of a captain who realizes the leak in the hull is coming from the engine room. You realize, he said finally, his voice level and devoid of inflection, that you just handed Jonathan's father a loaded gun. If we admit we knew about a pattern and didn't act, he can sue us for negligence. If we admit we flagged his son based on a metaphor, he can sue us for defamation. You have effectively placed the district in a pincer maneuver. He gestured to the timeline I had projected earlier. Now just a blank screen. That timeline is compelling. Jean. It's also a liability document. By proving we have a history of ignoring this, you've removed our ability to plead ignorance. I sat in the guest chair, my hands folded in my lap to hide the tremors. Ignorance was killing them, I said. Liability is better than a funeral, the vice principal sighed, shuffling a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like budget projections. We can't implement the full proposal, she said, cutting to the chase. We can't hire outside auditors. We can't mandate CPS reporting for metaphors. The union won't touch it. And the legal team will have a stroke. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It wasn't my proposal. It was a drafted memorandum. The ink still wet. But we can't do nothing. Not after what you said in there. The parents are spooked. The teachers are rattled. We need a container for this. I picked up the paper. It was titled Pilot Program for Holistic Review of Admissions Narratives. It was sanitized language for we will stop ignoring the screams. The terms were specific, narrow, and terrifyingly heavy. It authorized the creation of a secondary review flag in the submission system. It allowed for a counselor intervention interview prior to the finalization of transcripts. But the final clause was the hook, the implementation, training, and case management of this pilot program shall be the sole responsibility of the lead counselor. All liability for case assessment rests with the désigné. They were offering me the change I wanted, but they were making sure the cost came out of my pocket. They were appointing me the warden of the grey area. If I flagged a kid and was wrong, it was my error. If I missed a kid and was wrong, it was my negligence. The administration was walling itself off, leaving me standing alone in the gap between the students and the system. "You want a scapegoat," I said. Looking at the principal, "I want a firewall," he corrected, his eyes meeting mine with a cold, pragmatic honesty. "You opened this door, Jean. You insisted we look into the dark. Fine. We're looking. But someone has to hold the flashlight, and someone has to take the blame if the battery dies. If you want this protocol, you own it. You design the training. You conduct the interviews. You take the heat from the parents. If you sign this, the tick box goes live tomorrow. If you walk away, we go back to literary metaphors, and we never speak of this meeting again." I looked at the document. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt heavier than the archive files, heavier than the yellow pad. Signing this meant the end of my anonymity. I would no longer be the nice counselor who handed out tissues and college brochures. I would be the problem woman, the one who saw danger in adjectives, the one parents whispered about at soccer games. The workload would double. The emotional toll would be astronomical. But then I thought of the list in my drawer. Jonathan, Sarah, Michael. I thought of Elena, sitting in that diner, telling me I had let the road degrade. I had spent 15 years protected by the safety of not my job. I had prioritized my own comfort over their survival. The ringing sound of the porcelain didn't stop just because I closed my door. If I didn't sign this, the next Elena would fall down the stairs, and I would have to watch it happen knowing I had held the pen that could have stopped it. The guilt of action was heavy. Yes, but the guilt of inaction was a stone that never dissolves. I had carried that stone for a decade. I was done with it. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own pen. It clicked loudly in the silent room. "I need one modification," I said, my voice steady. "I want the archive digitized and flagged retroactively. I want the history visible." The principal hesitated, then nodded once. "Done?" I signed my name. The ink flowed black and permanent onto the page. Jean Vance, lead désigné. It wasn't a triumph. There was no swelling music, no applause from the faculty. It was a transaction. I had traded my professional safety for a chance to intervene. 1 year later, the light in my office looked exactly the same. The late spring sun still sliced through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air like suspended memories. The smell of laser printer ink was still acrid, and the stack of essays on my desk was just as high as it had been the season before. But the texture of the room had changed. On my computer monitor, the new software interface glowed. Next to each student's name, there was a small, unassuming icon, a grey flag. It was the tick box I had fought for, the digital manifestation of a conscience. I opened the first file. Essay_042.doc. I scanned the text. My eyes trained now, not just for grammar, but for the code. The prose was standard. Sports victories, volunteer trips. I clicked clear flag. Then I opened the next one. A girl named Maya. She wrote about cooking dinner. It seemed mundane until the third paragraph. When the kitchen gets too quiet, I know the weather is changing inside the house. I check the locks. I put the knives in the drawer with the child-proof latch. Even though there are no children here, I stopped. The old me would have noted the atmospheric imagery. The new me saw the coordinate. I moved my mouse and clicked the grey flag. It turned red. A pop-up window appeared. Initiate intervention protocol. I clicked yes. The system worked. It wasn't magic. It didn't save everyone. We had caught Maya early. Her parents were furious. But we had enough documentation to get her into a counselling group without their consent under the new mental health provision. I looked at the framed photo on my desk. It wasn't a family photo. It was a picture of the graduating class from last year. Jonathan hadn't gone to Stanford. The intervention had blown up his household just as his father had threatened. He had deferred college for a year, moved in with an aunt, and was working at a bookstore. It wasn't the perfect future, but he was safe. He had emailed me once. A short note. It's quiet here. I don't have to count the shards. Sarah had gotten her scholarship. We helped her emancipate. A messy legal battle that left scars. But she was studying engineering 2 states away. Michael was harder. He had refused the help, retreated further into his hoodie, and vanished after graduation. We couldn't save them all. The system had cracks, and some people still slipped through. But at least now, we weren't greasing the cracks to make the slipping easier. I opened the bottom drawer. The yellow legal pad was still there, but it wasn't hidden under manuals anymore. It sat on top, a working document. The list of names on it was longer now, but they weren't secrets. Next to each name was a status update. Referral made. CPS contacted. Safety plan active. I thought of Elena. We had met for coffee one more time. She hadn't hugged me. She hadn't forgiven the past. But she had agreed to come in and speak anonymously to the teachers about decoding trauma. It was a start. We were building a bridge over the wreckage we had both survived. I looked back at the screen. The cursor blinked next to Maya's name. The red flag was bright against the white background. It was a warning, yes, but it was also a beacon. The bell rang in the hallway, the same sharp, electric shriek that used to make me jump. Today, I didn't flinch. I knew what the sound meant. It wasn't just the end of a round. It was the signal to pay attention. I picked up my pen. I had 40 more essays to read before the sun went down. The silence of the room was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the voices I had finally learned how to hear. I adjusted my glasses, took a breath, and began to read.